And welcome to all in the audience here at the Eileen L. Parsons Auditorium this evening. And to those of you who are tuning in with us via social media. This evening's collaboration is between the International Affairs Unit of the Government of the British Virgin Islands and the Virgin Islands Studies Institute of H. Lavity Stout Community College. And this presentation is on the results of the self-governance report to the Virgin Islands by expert presenter, no other than Dr. Carlyle Corbin, who is no stranger to the British Virgin Islands, and also Mrs. Shayna Smith-Archer, consultant and host of Vigilante Dialogues, as this evening's moderator. Our guest, Dr. Corbin, will be formally introduced shortly. I am Bernadine Louis, Director of the Virgin Islands Studies Institute here at the college. Again, I bid you all welcome for attending and for your anticipated participation after the presentation. I will now call on Ms. Najan Christopher, Director of the International Affairs Department, to introduce our special guest and our moderator for this evening's session. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to introduce both of our presenter, and I'll also introduce our moderator for the discussion portion, so that we can just flow right into everything. Dr. Carlyle Corbin is an international advisor on governance, and he's the designer of the self-governance indicators diagnostic tool, which assesses self-governance, sufficiency, and preparedness in island non-independent countries, such as the Virgin Islands. He has conducted self-governance assessments covering Caribbean and Pacific countries, most recently in Curacao, French Polynesia, Norfolk Island, which is an island in affiliation with Australia, Guam, and the Virgin Islands. He is the former Minister of State for External Affairs of the United States Virgin Islands and member of its former Political Status Commission, an advisor to its 5th Constitutional Convention. He was the founding Secretary General of the Inter-Virgin Islands Conference and its successor, the Inter-Virgin Islands Council. He has served as international advisor to the Premier of Bermuda, the Prime Minister of Curacao, and the President of French Polynesia, respectively. He has been the United Nations Development Programme's constitutional advisor to the Anguilla Constitutional and Electoral Reform Committee. He is the international advisor to the USVI 5th Constitutional Convention and the UNDP expert to United Nations special missions to Bermuda and the Turks and Caicos Islands. He has served as a visiting lecturer in global affairs at the University of the Virgin Islands Institute for Future Global Leaders, and he is the visiting lecturer in Dependency Governance Studies at the University of Guam, where he introduced the Dependency Governance academic curriculum. He lectures globally and writes extensively on dependency governance studies, and he is the author of 3 books and numerous scholarly articles in the fields of paradiplomacy and external affairs. I know you would want to take this opportunity to warmly welcome Dr. Carlyle Corbin. And our moderator for the discussion portion of this event is also no stranger to us, Mrs. Shayna Smith Archer. She's a woman of purpose who believes that to whom much is given, much is required. Shayna was the valedictorian of the BVI High School class of 1993 and is an engineer by training, a project manager by trade, and more than anything else, a patriot at heart. After her college graduation in 2002, she was excited and nervous about returning home and contributing to the development of her beloved BVI. She worked in the Ministry of Finance from 2003 as a senior project officer in the Project Support Services Unit. Her 8-year public service career included working on major projects such as the Valley Administration Building, the North Sound Administration Building, and the H. Lafty Stout Community Center Learning Resource Center. In 2011, she took the leap of faith and started her management consultancy firm, Smith and Associates, which provides project management and business consulting services to clients. She is honored to have been on major projects to improve our medical system, which included the Peebles Hospital project in 2012. Shayna is a community activist. She produces and hosts the local talk show, the Vigilante Dialogues, and is the co-host of a regional show, Territories Talk. The focus of both shows is to educate the public and encourage a change in conversation, from complaining about problems to finding solutions. Out of a love for her country, she ran for political office in the last 3 elections with a vision to build a country that future generations would be proud to call home. I want to take this opportunity for us to welcome also as moderator this evening for this discussion, Ms. Shayna Smith Archer. So without further ado, I will invite Dr. Corbin to give us his presentation. Thank
you. Good night. After Ms. Christopher left the podium, I have to take the mic down, because it's always a great honor to be in the Virgin Islands. And the last time I was at this podium, I was introduced by my good brother and friend, longtime associate, Elton Georges, the late Elton Georges. So I have a very close affinity to this hall and this podium. And that was the last time I actually saw him. I think that we have a presentation today, and it's going to have the PowerPoint. And the issue, of course, also our moderator is the second time I'm being moderated by Shayna because we did it on Territories Talk. We had a very deep conversation along with some other colleagues on this very same issue of evolution, constitutional political evolution of remaining territories in the Caribbean. And Territories Talk is a very fundamental vehicle for that dialogue amongst the people of the territories. It's something that I would commend everyone to. I think it's Facebook as well. It's on Facebook. So let me begin with the issue. First of all, I was commissioned to do a study which utilizes the self-governance indicators, and I'll speak a bit about that shortly. But it is the assessment of self-government sufficiency, country Virgin Islands. Can we go to the very first slide, if we can? Okay. This is the sense of territories globally that remain. There are 17 territories. There are territories administered by the United Kingdom, United States, France, New Zealand as well. And these are 17 territories that are listed by the United Nations and in the category of non-self-governing territories. This category is pursuant to Article 73B of the United Nations Charter. So these territories, as you can see, are wide-ranging. Most of them are in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. The 6 British territories in the Caribbean Atlantic, as well as the U.S. Virgin Islands, are on the list of non-self-governing territories, along with others in the Pacific region. The next one, please. Thank you. Okay. The dependent areas are clearly delineated here, and it gives you the interesting impression that the Caribbean has a number of different models of territories throughout the world, and more so than any other region of the world in such a small space. So you can see the color-coded framework here, which shows you that we have obviously large numbers of territories, British, French, Dutch, and US. And even within the Dutch, you have 2 different models. You have within the US, you have arguably 2 different models. And certainly the French have 2 different models. So the variety of arrangements that exist are, and we'll go to the next slide, you'll see the actual listing, but the variety of those territories it really does challenge one to determine what the actual arrangements are. And of course, this comprises what is referred to in the independency studies at this time. Go to the next one, thank you. So there's a listing. On the left side, NSGTs, non-self-governing territories. That's, again, the United Nations designation. And all of these territories are listed by the United Nations. Were originally listed in 1946 by General Assembly Resolution 66-1, where the territories were placed on that list by the countries that administered them. And of course, in that period, 1946, since the end of World War II, over 72 territories have been what is referred to as decolonized. They have risen to the full level of self-government, and through a process generally of self-determination. Now, through my period of days here in the Virgin Islands, during our discussions on radio and various other, met with the Youth Parliament and various other organizations, it was the issue of self-determination and independence comes to play. And it's important to note that self-determination is a process. It results in decolonization, and decolonization can take several forms. Independence is one form, free association is a second form, and integration is the third form. So again, that's important to note, because I believe that the concepts of self-determination, depending on who's advocating there is indeed a distinction, and there are choices and there are options in terms of achieving what we refer to as the full measure of self-government. The left side, once again, are the 6 British territories and U.S. Virgin Islands. These are the 7 that are on the list in that space. In the middle category, the autonomous territories, these are the Dutch territories, Aruba, St. Martin, and Curacao, and that's the southern part of St. Martin. And these are referred to as autonomous countries, or in their relationship with the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Puerto Rico is also in the autonomous category, although it's clear that based on developments and the reassessment of their arrangement, they should probably be in the first category. of non-self-governing. But that is a decision of the member states of the United Nations to remove and place them back on the United Nations list, and so far that has not occurred. But their effective autonomy is not that much different than that of the U.S. Virgin Islands or other U.S. territories. And finally, St. Bart's and French St. Martin are also in that category as of 2007. Prior to that, those two were under Guadeloupe. And of course, Guadeloupe is in the third category of integration. They are integrated departments of France, and Guadeloupe, Martinique, French Guiana, and Guadeloupe actually had dependencies themselves, and those were St. Bart's and French St. Martin until 2007, and now they are separated in the context of an autonomous arrangement as well. And the Dutch themselves also have a form of integration, Bonaire, Saba, and St. Eustatius close by. They became partially integrated into the Kingdom of the Netherlands. In fact, their integration was not in the full kingdom, but rather integration with the one country known as Holland. Holland is one of 4 countries in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the other 3 being St. Martin, Aruba, and Curacao. But peculiarly, Saba, Statia, and Bonaire were placed not with St. Martin or with Curacao for clear geographic and cultural reasons. That would have made sense, but they were placed under Holland, so that I leave that question open because I have no reason to know why that would be the case. However, those territories this new constellation was developed in 2010 after various referenda which took place in each of the islands and separated them out. Aruba actually was in place and that separated itself out in 1986, so they separated earlier than the rest. But now 2000 and 2010 was when the whole entire, what was formerly known as the Netherlands Antilles, as we know, no longer exists. And it broke up, it dismantled at that time. Okay, the final one on that list of integration is one that is not often discussed in this context. That is San Andres, and including San Andres as an archipelago, which also includes Providencia and Santa Catalina. Those are the 3 islands that are under the jurisdiction of Colombia within the Western Caribbean. And of course, the ethnic and cultural makeup of those islands are very much Caribbean, and the political designation, certainly the political affiliation, is with Colombia, and there's some historical reasons for that. Okay, we can go to the next one. Yeah. Okay, so let's get to the actual assessment itself. There's the methodology that is used, or is essentially the methodology comprising a number of international instruments. This assessment mechanism is a diagnostic tool to assess the compliance of territories with respect to international minimum standards set by the United Nations. The 3, as we see, international instruments, the primary international instruments for this assessment are the UN Charter, the relevant human rights conventions, and also relevant United Nations resolutions. Go to the next one. Okay. So the charter itself is in fact specific chapters of the charter and articles of the charter, particularly Articles 1 and 55, which deal with the equal rights and self-determination of peoples. That is important in the sense that there is a recognition, and this is the charter, which again was approved and adopted in 1945. Article 73 is of particular importance to territories, because that is the article that deals with the political, constitutional, social, and evolution of the territories themselves. But what Article 73 does is places the onus of the developing these territories on the countries that administer them. So the countries which administer territories whose people have not achieved a full measure of self-government must develop self-government in those territories. This is the international legal obligation of the countries that administer territories to bring the territories to the full measure of self-government. Once again, the full measure of self-government can come in three forms, as we noted. Independence being one, free association, or integration. This is determined by the people and also determined by the country in which they have a political relationship with. Okay, we can go to the next. Several of the second category of international instruments in relation to the composition of the diagnostic tool is the use of the international conventions, human rights conventions in particular, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And there are a number of others. But in particular, these two, because in fact, both of them have as very primary in their text the important reference to the fact that all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. You can go to the next, okay? Okay, and so there are other international instruments also in use as well with respect to the compilation of the indicators. The other international instruments include the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In the Pacific, we also use the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this particular instrument is specific to Caribbean territories and the indicators that are specific to the Virgin Islands themselves, or itself. Now, go to the next slide. We go to the third category of evidence coming from the nature of the resolutions of the General Assembly. First, the Charter, and then the Human Rights Conventions, and the third being the United Nations resolutions. That gives substance to the Charter and direction. The particular resolution, 1514, is a resolution which provides for, confirms that the right of self-determination is inalienable. And it also emphasizes the importance that immediate steps should be taken to transfer all powers, without condition or reservation in advance of self-determination. So that speaks to the issue of preparatory. You're preparing the territories according to the Charter of the United Nations, which requires that preparation. So in the context of transferring of powers is a very important element of that preparatory process. It also it makes clear reference that there's a necessity of bringing an unconditional end to colonialism in all its forms and manifestations. And I think we go back to the chart, with the color-coded chart with all of the various models that I discussed earlier. And we're talking about different forms and manifestations that need to be addressed. Okay, we'll go to the next one. The second resolution of note is the companion resolution to the Decolonisation Declaration, this one is Resolution 1541. And this resolution is the very important element because it does include minimum standards for each of the three options. So independence, there are some minimum standards. Free association, the particular minimum standards in relation to the ability to draft the Constitution without external interference. And the issues of free association also is primarily based upon a mutual consent between two parties. So you have two countries which agree to associate on the basis of the agreement in which they are able to negotiate. And the third of the standards, and again, integration, and there are also minimum standards with respect to integration, and those standards include full political rights, full economic, social, and cultural rights within the country that the former territory is integrating into. So you have a clear basis that when you utilize this framework, you will find in our assessment that was done with Bonaire, we found that their integration was not full. It's partial. They have only voting rights in one house and not in the other house, and they have no representation whatsoever in the house, which is inconsistent with full political rights. So there are some adjustments that would have to be made to bring Bonaire and Saba and Statia, for that matter, to the full measure of self-government under integration. Whereas, if you compare to Martinique, Guadeloupe, and French Guiana, you will find there are full political rights, full participation, presidential vote, voting representation in the French Parliament and the House, and so you do have, in fact, and the Senate as well, both houses of the French Parliament, there is representation, voting representation. Now, you find some models like this elsewhere as well, and we could speak a bit about that a bit later. Okay. So this gives you a sense of the very fact that I was earlier discussion today. A young person from the Youth Parliament made a reference to the fact that it's the idea of the resolutions specific to the Virgin Islands is not a well-known fact. And indeed, resolutions have been adopted on the Virgin Islands dating back to the beginning of the United Nations, certainly from 1946 onward. And in some cases, the resolutions were on all territories, including the Virgin Islands, but at a certain point, the resolutions began, very specific resolutions on the Virgin Islands, and there's a compilation of those resolutions. In fact, the assessment did go into examining the resolutions from the full set of resolutions from that period, that early period, and in terms of looking at the recommendations that had been made over time in terms of bringing the territory to the full measure of self-government. This is part of, once again, of the preparatory process as a function of Article 73B of the Charter. But this is the front page, if you will, of the resolution on the latest resolution on the Virgin Islands, which was adopted in December of 2021. Now, the process is an annual one, so currently the sequence begins in February, where the Special Committee on Decolonization meets to organize itself by during that period, normally by March, and unfortunately I have not as yet, but there's a preparation of a working paper prepared by the UN, which on an annual basis, which provides a set of a great deal of information, mainly economic information, situations with regards to political discussions, any constitutional issues that might arise. Much of the information is garnered from public sources. In fact, all of it is garnered from public sources, and the information that is submitted to the United Nations by the United Kingdom, which is pursuant to Article 73E of the United Nations Charter, which requires that countries that administer territories to provide information on those territories to the United Nations. That information is also augmented by information that is submitted to the United Nations by the elected government of the territory itself. Now, this is something that is not consistent across the board with respect to all of the territories, but I refer to those territories who do participate in this process as the enlightened ones, because in fact, it is often the case that the information that the United Nations receives is incomplete. So you want to have the best information possible. And the perspectives of the territorial government are always welcome with respect to knowing the actual situation on the ground. The Virgin Islands government has been very active in recent years in this very commendable way to provide such information. When I was in government in the U.S. Virgin Islands, we had probably the longest period of active participation beginning, I'll date myself now, beginning 1975, although I wasn't there, when Governor Cyril King was the governor, and he was the first governor to address the United Nations Decolonisation Committee. By the time 1977, there was a visiting mission of the United Nations, and perhaps the following year, or it was either the year before or the year after, the visiting mission also came to the Virgin Islands as well. And then subsequently, by 1982, the governments participated in, the government of the U.S. Virgin Islands participated in the decolonization committee process, and that was consistent through 2006, when Dr. Charles W. Turnbull demitted office, and I also demitted office at the time. And that after that point, the government of the U.S. VI decided overtly or inadvertently to not participate any further. So the ideas of maintaining that momentum did not sustain. But that's the decision of any government that has the opportunity to make such decisions, and that's where they are at this point. Next, you can go to the next one. The resolution on the Virgin Islands, the very recent one, relates to a number of issues, but I think there's two particular issues to highlight in noting and recognizing that all available options for self-determination of the territory are valid, as long as they are in accordance with freely expressed wishes of the people and in conformity with the clearly defined principles contained in the resolution. And what that means is the people, it's a decision of the people, number one, but it's also the point that the resolutions must comply with minimum standards. It's one thing to have a status that is seen as a legitimate status, but if in reality it may not be in compliance with the minimum standards which are set in order to ensure that there is full self-government. Okay, the next one. Okay, this was also referenced in the Virgin Islands resolution to the fact that there's no alternative to the principle of self-determination, which is also a fundamental human right. So the idea that the territory has the political rights, but it is also a fundamental human right for the purpose of decolonization and self-determination. So it raises the bar, if you will, to the point of recognizing the importance of decolonization and self-determination as a human right. Okay, next one. Okay, so we go to the indicators, and in terms of the mechanism that, yes, no, we go back. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's it. All right, yeah. The self-governance indicators are basically the diagnostic tool that is used for the purpose of assessing the circumstance in each individual territory. These indicators were developed in 2011 and presented at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. Following the presentation and the vetting of the indicators, the adjustments were made, and by 2012, the indicators were published in a book entitled Non-Independent Territories in the Caribbean and Pacific, which was published by the Institute for Commonwealth Studies. These self-governance indicators are designed to do a number of things. First, to assess the progress towards self-government sufficiency and the level of power balance, or in some cases imbalance, between the territory and the cosmopole. So we look at the actual relationship and the power relationship in terms of whether it's the extent of mutuality or the extent of unilateral authority. Okay, next one. Okay, the self-governance indicators are used to define compliance of the cosmopole with their international obligations, right? Again, 73B of the Charter requires the countries that administer the territories to advance the territories to full self-government. And of course, the SCIs are also used to gauge the level of preparation of any given territory to determine the extent of that transfer of power is required. And of course, in this context, transfer of powers are in the context of devolution of power rather than delegation of power. And I think there's an important distinction to be made. Delegation of power is reversible. That devolution of power is not. So we go to the specific indicators of the Virgin Islands in the next one. We utilize 11 of the indicators for non-self-governing territories, and these are the ones that are looking at both the compliance as well as the level of preparation of individual indicators of the territories with respect to their adoption and ability to prevent and to encompass the powers that are required. If you look through them, I think the very first one deals with the question of self-determination obligations, and we'll go through it quickly, but I will also show you toward the latter part how the scoring is done. The issue of the role of unilateral applicability of whether or not that is dominant, the role of how much mutual consent there is, or is it mutual consultation? There's a distinction between those things. The extent of governance, the development of capacity, and this speaks to the issue of preparation for self-government. How has the territory developed in its capacity to govern and also to certainly run the affairs of government, and also specifically even within the framework of the private sector and the broad control of the economy. The issue of external affairs is also an important element. We heard from Ms. Christopher, who's the head of the External Affairs Secretariat. The issue of participation of territories in external affairs is in fact one of the most important elements of the development of capacity, because your territories are able to participate in a number of areas that are available to us. And we participate in the United Nations various agencies in the social and economic sphere, Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, CARICOM, and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States are also available. The Virgin Islands is part of all of those. The UNESCO, the Virgin Islands is part of that. The Virgin Islands, in fact, has developed the largest and broad-ranging capacity than any other territory in the Caribbean. And so the idea of preparation in the level of external affairs is at a high level. And certainly, it's not only is it for the purpose of being present, but also in the purpose of interacting with colleagues and in territories similarly situated, as well as in terms of developing, being able to gain training, expertise, resources. The Caribbean Development Bank is another source where the Virgin Islands is part of, and I recall within the framework of the assessment, the role that the Caribbean Development Bank has played in terms of the post-hurricane assistance. So that is a very wide, broad area that, in fact, does help significantly in creating and enhancing the capacity. We also look at the issue of the autonomy in economic and cultural affairs in terms of the areas of education, the ability to integrate those areas into the curriculum. One of the specific areas that is so important is the development of this institution, the Ace Larrity Stout Community College, which in fact does provide for a very important role in terms of many areas, not only in terms of general education, but certainly we speak of this in the context of linking the curriculum with the economy. And I think that is one of the most important elements of the course offerings and programs at HLSCC are linked directly to the economy. And therefore, again, you're talking about capacity building in order to ensure that they're trained workforce in specific areas of the economy rather than having it in isolation from that. So this is an important element. And finally, we're looking at the ownership and control of natural resources, which is a very key, important element. The resolutions on the Virgin Islands from the United Nations refer also to other territories that indicate that the natural resources of the territory are to be owned and controlled by the people of the territory. However, there's some inconsistency here because, in fact, the exclusive economic zone is owned by the United Kingdom as opposed to the territory. So there's some inconsistencies with respect to that. So we point that out as well. Okay, we go to the next one. Okay, so the areas of review which the assessment examined, actually we take a particularly historical perspective to look at the evolution of self-government in the territory. And certainly we begin as far back as the Aboriginal period and how the people governed themselves in that period. We also note the various clashes and conflicts that took place during that time as well. We go through the early European colonial period, the British colonial period as well, and then we emerge into both the pre-emancipation period and the post-emancipation periods. And of course, we know the evolution of the structures of government, and also the fact that during this time, even in the immediate post-emancipation period, the idea of elections were restricted even in the post-emancipation period. It took some time before a majority of the population was given full rights in the system. The assessment also then, from that point, moves into examining the constitutional orders of various orders, 1967, 76, and of course 2007. And finally, the assessment examines the United Kingdom dependency governance policy. Now, those policies, the most recent one, of course, Partnership for Progress and Prosperity, at the beginning of the 2000s, or it's actually 1999. But also, not so much the policy, in addition to the policy itself, how the policy is projected outside. So we go back to the United Nations discussions, and we find that if in examining the policy statements that the United Kingdom makes to the United Nations with respect to the Virgin Islands and other UKOTs as well, in the context of the dependency governance policy, has taken a decided shift from promoting self-determination to more of a dependency legitimization. So the idea of promoting self-determination is now given way to a form of modernization of the current arrangement, even as the power between the cosmopole and the territory is still uneven, and there's still the unilateralism that is inherent in the policy. So we looked at that as well. And of course, the findings themselves from at this point, in the next slide, summary of findings, you will find that the measurement is from 1 to 4, 4 being the most progressive, and 1 being the least progressive. And we will find that most of the of arrangements are within the range of 2 and 3. And you find certainly with respect to compliance, for example, the first one, compliance with self-determination obligations, which is a compliance of the United Kingdom for this purpose. The issue, there is a recognition of the right to self-determination, but at the same time, it is superseded by seeming as subordinate to the ability to maintain the territory in the current arrangement. The issue of unilateral applicability of laws, That is a basic continuation of the issue of, there's some mutual consultation on some of the laws, but most of the time you find that the applicability is unilateral. In the context of evolution of governance capacity, which I made reference to earlier, that is number 3. It's a very significant evolution, and this evolution has been achieved both from support from the United Kingdom as well as internal initiatives on the part of the successive elected governments that have recognized the importance of its own human resource development and its own ability to bring together to ensure the development of the society. The 4th being the authority to write the internal constitution independently. That is clearly within the framework of the constitutional review process, and recognizing that there's several stages to that. The internal constitutional review, which is upcoming, and you will find the public meetings and various discussions, which I'm sure will once again emerge. And in the end, a negotiating team is created, and there will be discussions with the United Kingdom. But in the end, the United Kingdom determines what goes in. And so it's a discussion, but the final analysis, there's still the unilateral authority. And this has much to do also with the question of transfer of power. So the idea is and this has been consistent throughout the review processes in the earlier times, the idea of transfer of power and also the reduction of power of the appointed governor. Okay, let me go to the next one. So we'll go through a few more of them. The extent of evolution of governance capacity through external affairs, I made reference to that, and it's a high level. It comes in at number 3. The only reason why it's not number 4 is because of the language in the constitutional order, which does give the United Kingdom the final authority if there is a difference of opinion on a particular point. The number 7, basically number 7 relates to the awareness of political status options, and we judge that at number 3 because of the consistent review processes underway, the discussions that emanate from external affairs, from the H. Laverty Style Community College, the various other entities and institutions that discuss these issues to varying degrees throughout society, throughout the years. The issue of preparation in terms of activity and participation in the political system of the United Kingdom is viewed in the framework of being a preparatory exercise, but there is no representation at this time, so it's judged at number 1. Although there have been some, I'm sure you are aware of proposals in the House of Commons to bring such participation as well, but these proposals have not moved forward. And some would argue that such participation is inconsistent with self-determination because it takes a position of possible movement toward a form of integration. So that's an argument which we also heard. And finally, the next 2, the degree of autonomy in economic affairs and the degree of autonomy in cultural affairs, we rated at number 3 in both instances. So the final extent and control of natural resources, as mentioned earlier, there is some degree of a shared management, and that management is very, very keen in terms of the marine resources and the protection of the fisheries and these matters that are done very well. But the overall point is the ownership of the area. And in fact, the area is not just necessarily the resources, but there are also other elements which we have discovered in other assessments that we have done. One in particular is the territory of French Polynesia, which we did an assessment in 2013. And they have thousands of islands, 5 million square kilometers of Pacific Ocean. And not only do they have various, obviously a very large amount of water and fish, but they also have very strategic undersea minerals, cobalt, magnesium, all those things that go into the cell phones, and under the seabed. But they also have some other resources that people don't necessarily think about. And how about the amount of overflights through this airspace? Because what's little known of this is that there's a fee for every flight that flies through the airspace of your country. But the fees generally go to the north. They go to France, they go to London, they go to Washington. And so, but this is a revenue derived from the economy of the territory. So sometimes you hear the arguments that the territory, or any given territory, is a drain on the economy or on the finances of the cosmopole, or that the territory is not self-sufficient, although that's not necessarily the case with respect to the Virgin Islands. But the point is, there are revenue sources that are being diverted, and this is the case, and this is something that perhaps could be something to look at with respect to the Virgin Islands, but certainly it has been looked at in other territories. Okay, so final concluding observations of the assessment. First of all, the current arrangements of the United Kingdom overseas territories in general reflect the idea that the current status need not advance any further, so that the current status has been modernized and perhaps further modernized in the future, but the idea that it is a status in and of itself to be redefined as a legitimate status of full political equality, that is something that's very much contained in the arguments that are made at the United Nations in particular. The second bullet, the assessment reaffirms, however, that the current status is meant as preparatory and transitional to a new status, that it was never meant to be a permanent status. But over time, that is what has occurred. It has become, in many ways, many people have seen it as such, as a permanent status. It's very interesting to note that in the context of the Caribbean, the last independent country was St. Kitts and Nevis, which was 1983. And from 1983 to today, there's been no change, with the exception of those two that I referred to, St. Bart's and St. Martin, which just became collectivities coming out of Guadeloupe. The third bullet, a significant constitutional evolution has been achieved, and this is recognized, following on from the first constitutional order as early as 1950 onward. And this constitutional evolution is something that is very, very clearly recognized. Now, the next slide, please. Very recently, the Attorney General wrote a piece, and I think is important, we included it in the text, that the principles of international law import a general obligation to maintain a continuous process of development of self-government, so as to place the people of the Virgin Islands in a position ultimately to choose a new political status. So this is the thinking about further political and constitutional evolution, and this is something which is important to note. Our assessment itself had the conclusions that, quote, the Virgin Islands has advanced in the preparation for self-government through the development of political and administrative capacity to govern itself effectively. This has been achieved through successive periods of constitutional evolution, both with UK assistance and through national efforts and initiatives. And further, in the next slide, a most appropriate step in the process of political and constitutional evolution is a genuine and irreversible devolution of power via a transition to one of the permanent political status options of absolute political equality. Those three options are characterized by absolute political equality, either through independence, through a free association, or through integration. They provide absolute political equality in one of three ways. The upcoming constitutional review in the end, might, if reflect on this further evolution in the political and constitutional development of the Virgin Islands, and anticipate a very vibrant discussion, public discussion in all fields and all phases and all activities, and those of, and I'm sure, using the technology, that there will probably be a number of sessions in Territories Talk on this question, I'm sure. And with that, I thank you very much for listening for this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Corbin, for another informative talk. I'm sure it was a lot of information that some persons may be hearing for the first time. So we're going to take this opportunity now in terms of the discussion to allow our audience, I don't know if anyone's monitoring Facebook, but to take questions from our audience as it relates to anything that was said or any questions that anyone has. So I saw a couple persons writing feverishly. No one yet? Okay, so I'll start off with a few questions, Dr. Corbin. As it relates to what you said, I had an opportunity to read the summary findings, and a couple things jumped out at me as it relates to where we currently find ourselves. So as far as the indicators go, is there an overall score that we calculate? Because I added up all your scores. And we're barely past, it was what, 26 out of 44, I think it was. It's on. Was, okay, go. There you go. Let me see. Test. No. Let me grab the other one. Go ahead. Use that one.
Right. What? Yeah. Okay. Yes, the score really encompasses several issues. One being, of course, the preparation, but also the level of preparation is a function of the capacity of the competency being transferred. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, in some instances, the score is low because the competency has not been transferred. So it's still a function of the administering power.
Okay. All right. That's great. This one, yeah.
Oh. This one. Test.
No, that's the one that's not working. Go with that one. Okay. All right. So again, if you have any questions, please come up to the mic and we'll acknowledge you. So based on what I read in your report, this is the 4th international decade of the eradication of colonialism for the period 2021 to 2030. And this was a resolution that was passed in 10th of December 2020, which calls upon all administering powers to cooperate fully with the special committee to develop a constructive program of work on a case-by-case basis for non-self-governing territories to facilitate the implementation of the mandate of the special committee. Now, in reading this and then going to your findings where you mentioned that in 1986, that the UK formally withdrew from basically cooperating with C24. So I'm curious to know, how is that possible? And again, how does that affect us moving forward in terms of having a program of work that says it's going to prepare us to be able to make a decision on where we go next?
Yes. Well, I think certainly the withdrawal was an unfortunate determination. It was 4 years prior to the end of the Cold War. All these issues came into play around that time. The question, of course, at that stage was already the beginning of a discussion about legitimizing the status quo, and that came into earnest at the beginning of the 1990s, when the Cold War ended, firstly, and secondly, when the country of Namibia the territory of Namibia became independent. So the remaining territories were small islands. And the thinking changed. At that stage, the question was whether small territories had the capacity and the resources to stand on their own. And so at that stage of the game, and in addition to the fact that there was some degree of concern about the language of the resolutions that emerged from the special committee about decolonization, this is the rationale used. Now, how it affects the implementation, the mandate and the requirement under the Charter of the United Nations is that only for the territories to, well, for the administering powers, I should say, to provide information to the United Nations on the territory. That's the first point. But of course, the second point being bringing the territories to the full measure of self-government. Now, whether or not their participation in the special committee, their non-participation in the special committee, injures that process, it probably does. But there are also opportunities for the fourth committee to, which is the committee of the whole of the General Assembly, to where the United Kingdom does present. But however, in the special committee, there's a dialogue, and there's an attempt to express and request information and interchange, and that is what is missing right now.
Okay, so is it possible for the territory to prepare its own constructive program of work and present to C24?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There's a global program of work already existing. There's a program of work certainly can be created by the territory. There is something which also exists, it's known as a case-by-case plan of action, which for each territory it would be designed. We designed one for French Polynesia last year, and it's really a question of promoting it with the committee and to ensure that it's something that's taken into account.
Okay. Because one of the dots, I don't know if other persons picked up on it, where you spoke about constitutional reviews and the fact that even though we go through the community, do the town hall discussions, ask persons to write in, that it still has to be negotiated. And even after the negotiating team leaves, it still can be changed, basically in your absence, because the final decision is basically the House of Commons. So one of the things we have to be so careful with now in terms of the upcoming constitutional review is to make sure that we are taking this opportunity to actually think seriously, I would say, about what decolonization options are there and where, again, as part of that program of work, the idea I'm getting is that historically, as the constitutional order was reviewed over the years, it was about not just delegating powers, but actually positioning you basically to govern yourself. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, it certainly is.
Okay. So it seems as if the process is stalled, Doctor.
It has been referred to as stalled. And the part of the process, the reason for it having been stalled is severalfold. Certainly, the idea that the implementation of the mandate has been not achieved because of a lack of accountability, and that's an issue that we have raised, and we have raised this for a number of years. But also, in many respects, the level of the participation of territories is not where it should be. So you might find, obviously you find the Virgin Islands participating, and that is very helpful and useful, and extremely important, and cannot be underestimated. But you do not find that level of consistency amongst the other territories, whereas you find situations like Puerto Rico, for example, which is not even on the UN list, but yet has a decision of the UN that they could be a part of the committee's work. So when they have a meeting on Puerto Rico, there are over 100 people that show over a course of 2 or 3 days. So obviously there's a real indication that there's an interest on the part of that territory to be there. Now, also you have Western Sahara, which is the last, the penultimate, well, I would say the last territory, non-self-governing territory. And when there's a session on Western Sahara, there are over 100 persons as well. So, I mean, obviously they have a lot of people, and that 100 is a particular percentage of their population, but for the governments of the territories to not utilize that forum, which is available to them, and also not just governments, but you have NGOs, civil society, you have academics, you have others who are able to weigh in. And this helps because, in effect, if the item on, say, Cayman comes up, and nobody's there for Cayman, there's no discussion on Cayman. There may be a document, a report, a draft resolution, which may be dated, which may not have the proper information, but if there's no one there to correct the record, then that's what you get. And I think this is an issue that has to be addressed by ourselves, but also we have to put pressure on the system to implement what it has said it needs to do.
Yeah. And that also was going to be my next question in terms of saying that, and you mentioned it as far as accountability, because we know this resolution is several decades has passed since it was initially implemented. Since '86 now, they are saying that, they are fine with the status quo, essentially. And I noted in your report where you mentioned that the options that are there according to the UN, whether it's independence, free association, or integration, that in their, in their perspective, integration is not on the table.
This is the feeling, but also there's indication that neither is it something that's being seriously considered from the territory side as well.
Okay.
And the main aspect, of course, is free association, because in effect, that is another option which is considered to be obviously an option of political equality, but there is a certain reticence about offering it. And what has happened, this really dates back to a period of like 2002, 2003, when there was a decolonization seminar of the United Nations held in Anguilla. And it was the very first time and only time that one of these seminars was held in a territory. And because it was in a territory, you had chief ministers there. And as a result of that, there was a presentation made on the option of free association, and the majority of those chief ministers were astonished that this existed. And because no one ever, gave that information, their information was not transmitted. So the individual from the administering power, who was present at the seminar at that time, because this was the selectivity of participation, they decided to go to that seminar. And of course, they endorsed it. Yes, of course, this is an option that's available to you. But a month later, the governments were told it's not on offer. And the reason why they were told this is because of the perception of what it was, which really did not conform with international principles of free association. And of course, the main issue related to what is referred to the contingent liabilities, the idea that there would still be contingent liabilities under free association. And in fact, a genuine free association has no contingent liabilities. But this is the rationale used at this point.
Yeah, and I think I remember reading about, as an example of a free association, I think it's the islands off of New Zealand.
Yes.
Those are
Cook Islands.
the Cook Islands.
And Niue.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So in free association, as their example, because again, as you said, you negotiate what is in your interests on a case by case. The New Zealand, the country of New Zealand is basically responsible for, I think it's their defense, and that's about it.
That's it.
Everything else is under their control, and they're responsible for essentially their destiny.
Yes, it's very interesting. You mentioned Cook Islands and Niue because there are many models globally, but there are interesting models that exist whereby, in the case of Cook Islands, as you say, they have full internal self-government. They also share citizenship with New Zealand, so they've got that aspect. They also have a Cook Island citizenship along with it. So, and so these are very novel arrangements, but recognizing New Zealand's part of the Commonwealth as well. So the idea that there would be territories that have gone into free association And they have a very vibrant external affairs function, even to the point of signing bilateral agreements and also multilateral agreements in certain areas. And of course, that is very useful. Defense is something which they have signed an agreement with the New Zealand government that covers defense. So in the context of any territory that might be reviewing the potential for free association, that is an area, as a very good model to look at.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking at them as well as Tuvalu. I was very surprised to find out they were a colony.
At one time.
At one time. And very early, I think it was even from back in the 70s, that they basically became independent.
Yes.
You know, and the population is probably half of Tatola at the time. Just a note.
Yeah.
We have a question at the mic. Go ahead.
Yes, I have a question here from someone on social media, and they're asking, within your findings, sir, it noted that the United Kingdom also has a responsibility to prepare us, the Virgin Islands, to self-determination. Most often throughout the Virgin Islands, you would hear the people say that we are not ready or prepared. For example, our levels of food insecurity. While that responsibility lies with us, the people, what are the responsibilities of the United Kingdom as the administering power in leading the Virgin Islands to self-determination?
Yes, well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the responsibility lies in the United Nations Charter, and that is Article 73B of the Charter, which requires that the countries that administer territories to advance the territories to full self-government, and full self-government within the framework of those three options that we discussed.
I think also just to add to that, or in terms of bringing clarity for persons who are listening, that, you know, the indicators that you have, those are just sort of guidelines in terms of measure of governance. Because I think one of the current topics, because of the Commission of Inquiry especially, where it highlighted the areas for improvement, I would say, in our governance framework. Is this something where we should expect or want that all of those issues are solved before we talk about decolonization, or is that part or should be part of the work program that needs to be put in place to move us forward?
Well, I would say that it would be a bit premature to discuss what will be in the report, but I assume that there will be some recommendations that will be reviewed and to be determined. And part of that, of course, would be waiting on the actual text. Yeah.
Okay, but just let's say using specifically where they talked about food security, because there are independent countries that are just as or more food insecure than us. What are some of the things that would indicate that you are ready for self-governance? I think is what they're trying to get at.
Well, I think certainly what we looked at was the capacity building, the ability to govern, and with the human resource development, already that exists at a high level. And that, again, is a function of the educational system, is a function of this institution within which we sit, as well as every other element that exists, external affairs, that liaises with other institutions regionally and globally. All of that contributes to the development and capacity. Now, mentioning some areas such as food insecurity. Food insecurity exists. If it exists, it will exist in the same way the next day, even under a new status, although there may be some incentives to develop other elements of the sector of agriculture, for example, which might be something that would address that. But all countries in the region, regardless of their political status, have this issue of access to, in terms of issues such as food insecurity. But what is important, I think, to note is that the situation from one place to the next would not necessarily change fundamentally. So, for example, in issues of currency, I got that question this week quite a bit. Would there be a need to create a currency? And in fact, many independent countries throughout the world use the US dollar as their currency. That would not change. Other issues, the dynamics of the society really are developed to this level whereby a change would not elicit a major shift in what is happening on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. Okay, so there's a maturing process, but then some of these things are things that we need to deal with anyway, is what you're saying, as your development. So I think one of the key things that stood out for me in preparing for this then, Doc, is that the use of the word unilateral authority that you said, because in most of the 11 indicators, we talked about the ability of us making decisions locally, but then there's a but. So someone can basically come and overturn any and every decision that you make practically. And it's still there, so there's still a lot of the work that needs to be done there, I would say, around that. And I guess that would come with the constitutional order review in terms of how we negotiate being able to make final decisions in those areas that you highlighted.
Well, again, it's about the issue of transfer of powers and devolution of authority from the appointed governor to the elected government. And in fact, some has been done progressively already, but it also is possible that these things could theoretically be reversed. So that's why it's delegation and not devolution. Now, in this context, we will see where the idea is that certain things are essentially cannot be necessarily achieved under the current status. So how far can you achieve autonomy within the current status? Are there things which are almost essential for the administering power to retain from their perspective? So these are issues which could be raised, obviously, in the review. And I think the report of the Constitutional Review would reflect the views of the people in terms of what they see as the next step. But the next step, as you referred to earlier, is the negotiation process.
All right. Natch, how much time we have left? You go down there enjoying the conversation. I know. I just had one more question, Doc, and then again opening the floor as it relates to, it slipped to me. So we talked about unilateral, the constructive program. Oh, in terms of your work, do you have like a recent example of how you worked with a country to move them from non-self-governing to self-governing? Kind of in a nutshell, so we can get a peek into how it happened, on the ground. Because we understand the conversations at United Nations and, all these high-level meetings we hear about after the fact. But in terms of, I'm assuming you do some community work, similar to what you're here doing now in terms of raising awareness and educating. But how did that look, and how long did it take? I think, too, would be one of the things. I'm curious to know, was it a 10-year process or 10 days? Talk to us.
That is dangerously going into the internal affairs of a country.
Well, you don't have to tell us any state secrets.
No, I don't. My role is to assess and to provide observations on the basis of international principles. The governments themselves make that determination as to what to do with the assessment. This is not something I do advisory activities subsequently, but not specific to the role of the assessment in that process. I have done work with a number of the governments at the United Nations, for example, in terms of one of our assessments is a direct link in French Polynesia in 2013. At that time, French Polynesia was not on the United Nations list, but because of the assessment as a substantive document to looking at identifying their deficiencies in the relationship, the United Nations General Assembly then put those territories, put French Polynesia back on the United Nations list. Once it was really the third time in history of the United Nations that a territory was placed back on. So from that perspective, the assessment itself did have a particular role in the context of a political decision shortly thereafter. But obviously, there are other areas that can be utilized for this. But it's an awareness-raising exercise. It's a point of discussion. Everything in it, obviously, is not going to be agreed by everyone, but that's nothing's perfect. So you want to try to use it in a sense as a way of reviewing the situation from an external source, from an independent source, without any axe to grind, if you will, yeah. and therefore then that is helpful and useful in the framework of the internal national discussion.
Okay. All right. Did you have a question?
Yes, I have a very basic question, and this is to help persons who might be struggling.
Come a little closer to the mic. Not hearing you clearly.
Why was the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories created?
Why was it created?
Yes. Why was that list created in 1946?
Okay. Well, you could take it back really maybe a couple of decades prior to the creation of the United Nations and take it back to the League of Nations. And the idea that countries that had territories, there began to be a discussion about what to do with those territories. And of course, in the Pacific region, there were some unilateral interventions on the part of the Japanese to acquire a number of territories, and they were under a trusteeship arrangement of the League of Nations, ultimately resulting in a walkout and the League of Nations basically failing. But subsequently, when the United Nations was formed, the idea was, because it was formed right after the World War II, and the purpose of it was to try to bring about global world peace. But one of the clear elements in the charter was for countries that administered territories, and this is 1945, and there were territories all over the world. I mean, what we're dealing with today is a small number, even with the ones that are not listed. But we had a far large number of territories. Imagine the entire Caribbean were territories. All of Latin America, because of, they become independent for the most part in the 1800s, but all of the Caribbean, most of the Pacific were territories. So what were these large countries going to do? And the idea was to hold on to them for strategic reasons, for economic reasons, but the United Nations gave the mandate to develop these territories to self-government, and that is where it began. And so the United Nations resolution requested that the countries that administer territories, to place those territories voluntarily on the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories, where they can be reviewed, where recommendations can be made for how they could move forward. And I think that is the primary purpose of it. Of course, from that point onward, there was a series of annual review processes and also a number of areas that have, in fact, as a result, provided the basis for their coming to the full measure of self-government and then having been what we refer to as delisted. Okay, and this is where, now of course, when we speak about the dependency legitimization, the end result of that is to delist the territory before they're actually meeting the standards, and that's the issue where we're dealing with today.
All right. Any questions from our audiences, online or in-house? You have one? Okay. And then we'll start to wrap up.
Hello, good night, everybody.
Good night. Good night.
I have a question. I don't know if it's a fair one, but I remember that you mentioned that the last country to become independent in the Caribbean was 1983, St. Kitts and Nevis. And I'm wondering, because I seem to remember there was a slew of countries that became independent between 60s, 70s, I'm wondering what was the reason for this kind of abrupt, this halt on the desire. I don't know what it is. What happened that stopped countries becoming independent past that point? I don't know if it's fair to ask you that question, but I'm curious. I'm curious. It's a long time, 39 years.
I can only
You know?
speculate. But I think much of it had to do with being convinced that the countries were too small, the countries did not have sufficient resources, and so that it would be better off to maintain a political link with a larger state. I think you find certainly this to be the argument in many of the territories, particularly small territories. But of course, what happened after the breakup of the West Indies Federation and the individual larger countries of the Caribbean becoming independent as a result of that, what happened was the smaller countries remained. And that argument of being too small, not having the capacity to govern self, resulted in the creation of the West Indies Associated States, which was an associated state arrangement of all of the small states. However, it didn't last very long. And part of the reason is because the kind of association that it was did not conform to the minimum standards of free association. So when this arrangement was presented to the United Nations, because there was an attempt at that stage to remove the territories in a block because of the West Indies Associated States, the UN at that time was actually doing serious review of this, and they saw that there was some deficiency. So as a result, they did not agree that the countries could be removed because the relationship still was, there was a subject of unilateralism. And in fact, in many cases, that unilateralism was not direct but indirect. But they saw that reference. So therefore, shortly thereafter, each individual associated state within the West Indies Associated States became independent. And that, of course, led to the remaining ones. Of course, Anguilla was part of that arrangement, St. Kitts, Nevis, Anguilla, deciding not to go with St. Kitts and Nevis, but rather to revert to territorial status. And the rest, I guess you could say, is where we are today. I hope that answers your question.
It does. It also makes me want to learn more.
Yes. Thank you. I think I saw you earlier. I can't. Did we meet with I can't see, the lights are, but it seems we have a conversation before. Yeah, okay.
All right. Any other questions? Do we have any online questions, or we're good?
We had a follow-up to the online question about food insecurity, and we recognized that the person was saying that they're still not clear. So the question was, food insecurity lies with us, the people. What is the responsibility of the United Kingdom as the administering power in preparing us to self-determination? Is it something dealing with national security? Is it financing? I don't get it, but thank you. So I don't know if there's any more that you could expound a little bit. I think this has to do with the structure of all constitutional arrangement in the Virgin Islands. So maybe you can explain a little bit about how that works together so that this person could possibly be able to understand what they're
asking. So what did I say? Well, for me, I understand the question because one of your indicators talked about national security. And, persons would want to know what is the responsibility. If Britain or the UK has a responsibility to feed us, or make sure that we can feed ourselves, I think is what it boils down to. Because it's the same question of, would we be able to protect ourselves from a, invasion or something drastic along those lines in terms of national defense. And, for me, these are things, though, that fall within the National Sustainable Development Plan that we're currently working on, because those are the types of issues that I would say we need to put in as part of the goals that we want to achieve. So if food security is a goal that we want to achieve, we need to sit down and plan, how are we going to go about doing that, knowing that we have access to all these resources. And you also added now another dynamic to the mix, highlighting that we don't manage solely our natural resources. So in terms of saying we want to take advantage of the fisheries that exist in our waters, it almost sounds as if in some cases we may have to ask permission, depending on what it is we might have to do. So I would say that in terms of food security, it is part of the mix in terms of the National Sustainable Development Plan. How we go about that, if the UK now has, control of the natural resources as it relates, let's say as an example, the marine environment, then that's something that definitely would have to be negotiated to ensure that we accomplish that goal and are able to get to that place. Because the economic and the cultural affairs, which you touched on, we more or less have control or responsibility for those things and make decisions along those lines to continue to progress ourselves. Go ahead.
My last question. If we were to list out in order of priority, based on your report, based on the recommendations in terms of what the BVI needs to do in order to reach the point of one of those three options mentioned by the UN, what would that list look like?
That's a tough question there. But no, I would say that the issue of development of the evolution of power, I think, is important. There are certain areas in the relationship that can be transferred, and I would suspect that this would be part of the discussion in the constitutional review. A case can be made for certain things to be transferred. A case obviously can be made for ownership, having clarity on the questions of resources, and these things are things that very well may exceed the parameters of the perspective of what the current status is. Okay, there may be a point where they say, well, you cannot go any further than this and remain the way you are. And so at that stage, the people would have to make a determination, if not having made it before, as to whether or not they want to gain this, because in effect, gaining the authority to enhances sustainability. If decisions are made, but yet they're not agreed on the other side, then these decisions are made for the purpose of advancing the territory. But if those decisions are decided not to be agreed, they cannot be implemented. So therefore, that is a function of the current status. If in fact that persists, if that cannot be something that is relieved or even eliminated, then you're in a position where the decision making in the final analysis is not with the people, but rather decided elsewhere. And I think this is a point where the development of the society and in any territory, when a territory would get to that point, it's like, well, this is the point where we need to redefine the relationship. And I make this point, I made it a number of times this week, the idea that moving to another status does not mean that you are separating or that you are turning your back or all these various terms that people use and often use for the purpose of fear, the fear factor, right? I heard that phrase utilized as well. The issue is whatever arrangement is made, or whatever change is made at this stage, is really an evolution. It's simply a matter of a next step. It's nothing drastic that would take place, because already there's this high degree of capacity is very clear that step would be minor. Now, there are territories that I would not say that about, and that's for sure, because the decisions, however, in those territories have been such that they do not have that high level of capacity, and they've relied on other ways to get by. So but in the case of the Virgin Islands, the assessment it makes it clear that this capacity is at a high level.
That's good to know, Dr. Corbin. You'd say we're capable?
No, no doubt.
No doubt?
No doubt. No question about that.
That's all you need to tell me. Yeah. That's all I need to hear. Well, the last thing then, my thought came back. In terms of making the decision, and it's dovetailing right off of the question that she had, how does the population go about making those decisions? Because we've heard in the past about, for example, Bermuda having a referendum. In a conversation, I think it might have been the same show we had, Territories Talk, with the young man from Bermuda that spoke to, where his position is that they shouldn't have a referendum on it, but it should be part of, during elections, basically, decision on the ballot for voters to decide on. Is there a set way that this should be done, or is it something that it's, again, up to the society to decide how they want to make a decision on decolonization? Is it that we say first, do we decolonize? Because I think that should be the first thing, at least in my mind. And then from there, look at which of the statuses would be what we have the capacity to start working towards.
Well, I think that the process of decolonization ends with the selection of one of the options. And of course, its implementation. And certainly in the context of a referendum versus a general election, I think in past years, past decades, I would say, if a particular political party had a status change in their platform and they won the election, then the assumption is that that's what the people want. But there has been a decided shift from that position in probably since this was discussed particularly around following the 1995 referendum in Bermuda, and subsequently under the Bermuda Independence Commission, which was under former Premier Alexander Scott, who I had the honor to work with the Bermuda Independence Commission on the external affairs section of their report. And that issue arose in the context of the discussions as to whether election or referendum. And I think it was generally felt that referendum was important. But it also was recognized that a referendum is also more easily influenced from the outside, okay, for however reason it is. But the most important element of all of these things, and assuming that it would be a referendum, then the issue of unbiased information on options, or one or the other, or even if it's just one, the issue of whether or not the information can be, to the extent possible, unbiased and factual. And indeed, sometimes that's a challenge, because we often, I found this in the work in USVI, where we had a referendum on options in 1993, and that was our first and only referendum. And certainly, one of the features of that was one side, or the proponents of one option would make their point by belittling the other option, right? So it's not in a positive sense, my option is best because, it's like, this option is best because their option is not good, and that's the kind of dialogue that you want to try to minimize, probably never be able to minimize it. But certainly, in the context of taking that up to present day, you have a situation where you have social media, you have the internet, you have all these various ways in which people get information, and it's totally uncontrollable. And so, these things could be factored into the discussion. Another point on this, and final point on this, has to do with who conducts the referendum. Okay, and in the case of the Virgin Islands, it's the Virgin Islands that conducts a referendum. That's very important because I've done my work in the Pacific in the context of the French. It's the French that conduct the referendum. And this last referendum in New Caledonia, which ended in, well, the end of that is another discussion, but it was basically boycotted by the indigenous people. So the end result was 90% of the 40% said no, and therefore it's projected to the world that they said no. But the reason that they boycotted was because they had a big COVID outbreak, and their traditions are such that they had to mourn their people. They could not run a campaign under that environment, so they respectfully asked the French to hold off on the referendum. For a few months, the French said no. So, it's because the French also had expressed their position that they did not wish the change, that New Caledonia change their status. So how can they operate or conduct an unbiased referendum after having taken a side on the question? So this is a point that we have to also look very, very strongly in terms of how this thing goes forward.
And I think also the question of who votes in the referendum, because sometimes it's not just about registered voters; it may be opened up to residents. Is that the case, or it has to go based on the registered voters list?
Well, that is a decision on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
I mentioned New Caledonia. They had a very specific reference to who should vote, and part of that was because of the large number of French settlers who came over time. Mm-hmm. There was a very extreme situation there, so that the resulting was that the persons who could vote in the referendum had a 15-year residency requirement, which allowed for the long-term French residents to vote, but not the guys who just came. Mm-hmm. Now, and of course, in the case of some countries, the referendum is held on the basis of the current voter registry. Okay. And there have been instances where it also includes, for example, persons who live outside the territory, mm-hmm. who also have obvious cultural ties to the territory, the diaspora. Mm-hmm. The diaspora vote is an indication also, and in fact, attempting to give effect to that. These are very, very difficult issues, mm-hmm. but these are all things that should be considered.
A part of it, okay. Yeah. All right, so in the interest of time then, Dr. Corbin, I'll let you wrap up with your closing remarks. And
I have closing remarks?
I don't know. Tell us again that we have a right to become a country. I like that part of your speech. I just circled it.
Well, we all have rights. And I think that in closing, I just want to thank you for coming and listening, and I'm sure Facebook Live and all this, none of which I understand, by the way, but I know it exists, and therefore people are listening and discussing, and it's very, very important for us to keep the dialogue alive, use all of these instances as learning opportunities, and when the review emerges, to ensure that, to the extent possible, make your views known, support the mechanism, support the persons who are going to be in the hot seat in regards to this issue, because that's not an easy thing. And those who accept the challenge, are also accepting a bit of heavy pressure. I learned that a bit this week myself. I had a number of radio programs in that regard. So, but it only strengthens you. Right? It strengthens you, and of course, it sharpens you. And the movement forward will always be a positive sign. And I always say, we say in Polynesia, we use the phrase kia kaha, which translates to stay strong. And we also say stay strategic as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So as we come to the end of tonight's very enlightening and encouraging discussion, I want to thank our expert presenter, Dr. Carlyle Corbin, for being here. Thank you very much. The information was, of course, very extensive, and it's a lot of food for thought. And we certainly must do what we have to do. It's encouraging to hear that we are certainly on that path, and we will just have to make sure that this conversation continues until we are all on the same page. So, Dr. Corbin, thank you very much. And thanks to Mrs. Smith-Archer, Shayna, also for very ably moderating this evening and keeping the conversation flowing. Thank you. Thank you to those of you in the audience and those who are listening by social media, Facebook page, and other channels. We thank you very much on behalf of International Affairs, Ms. Christopher, and the college through my department, Virgin Island Studies. Thanks also to the technicians. Thank you guys for being here, and everyone that has been here tonight and helped in any way. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.